Following the defeat of the Axis powers at the end of World War II, an ideological power struggle formed between the capitalist United States and the Communist Soviet Union, centered around which nation's political ideology was superior. The tension around this conflict would build throughout the remainder of the 20th century, coming to be known as the Cold War, which served as a war of ideology with numerous proxy wars being fought in smaller countries, such as Korea, Vietnam, and many more. Because of this struggle, the US would become increasingly paranoid in relation to the spread of communism within the country, as a means of preserving the dominant ideology within their home. Throughout the 1950s, HUAC, the House on Un-American Activities Committee, would spearhead investigations into the spread of communism within the US, led by Senator Joseph McCarthy, focusing on the motion picture industry. McCarthy believed that the motion picture industry was a dangerous ground for communist influence, as the films being produced could influence the public and spread communist sympathies across America. The first to be investigated in these trials came to be known as the Hollywood 10, a group of 10 producers and writers who attempted to invoke the First Amendment as a means of protecting their freedom of speech. However, this would fail, leading to imprisonment for all 10 being investigated. Further, the trial of Larry Parks is a notable example from the HUAC trials, as he was the first Hollywood witness who decided to admit he had been a communist. However, he refused to identify other people that he had known to be communists, and as such he was blacklisted from Hollywood. This would set the precedent for future trials and brought forward a notion of distrust and refusal to cooperate among those being investigated. Another notable example from the HUAC trials is the case of Howard Da Silva, who refused to speak under the Fifth Amendment and was subsequently blacklisted. Da Silva would then return to New York to look for jobs in radio and theatre, where he was still refused work as he was seen as too much of a risk for the producers. The HUAC trials set the precedent for paranoia and hysteria towards communist influence in the US, as the constitutional rights that should have been accessible to all citizens, regardless of political beliefs, were effectively ignored in place of the idea of preservation of American beliefs. As a result, studios became more cautious over the types of films being made and the people that were being hired. Films in the 50s became centered around the preservation of American ideals, and often presented xenophobic propaganda in the form of alien invasion narratives, where the aliens could be seen as representative of communists. One of the most iconic films in this cycle is Invasion of the Body Snatchers, in which the small American town of Santa Mira is overrun by pod people, which are exact copies of everyone else, yet lack human emotion. The invasion of the pod people goes almost unnoticed, except for Dr. Miles Bennett, who resists them for as long as he can and eventually reports the invasion to the government. Through this, the film attempts to instill paranoia in its audience, urging them to remain vigilant over their neighbours for anything odd that may happen, applying to the threat of communism. This sentiment is reinforced in the iconic shot towards the end of the film, where Miles looks directly at the camera and cries, "You're next."
Look! You fools! You're in danger! Can't you see? They're after you! They're after all of us! Our wives, our children, everyone! They're here already! You're next! You're next! You're next!
Further, HUAC targeted not only communists, but anything that was deemed to be un-American in terms of threatening the hegemonic white society. This included minority groups such as illegal immigrants, and as Katrina Mann points out, the film can also be read as a warning against Mexican immigration to America. The pod people are shown to be harder working than the humans due to their lack of emotion, presenting the stereotype of competitive labor which is seen as a threat to the white population's ability to find work. Mann states, Siegel's film articulates a xenophobia more discursively connected to the threat of illegal aliens, Mexican migrant laborers. In the film, the concern is not only with race, but also with national origin and the problems of competitive labor. From this, Invasion of the Body Snatchers illustrates the 1950s America was not only paranoid over the threat of communism, but also towards the spread of illegal immigrants, as it presented a threat to the white hegemony present at the time. On the other hand, the 1951 film adaptation of Death of a Salesman presents an interesting example of a film with anti-American sentiment that was released at the time. Although Columbia Pictures attempted to absolve themselves of any anti-American sympathies, the film can still be read as anti-American from a textual sense. In an attempt to prevent picketers from targeting the film, Columbia Pictures issued a 10-minute short to be played before the film, entitled Career of a Salesman. This short actively worked against the material presented in Death of a Salesman, effectively stating that the film was meaningless, in order to diffuse any perceived anti-American sentiment. Arthur Miller, the creator of the original play, was outraged by the creation of this short, as he felt that it devalued his work, stating, "I was being asked to concur that Death of a Salesman was morally meaningless, a tale told by an idiot signifying nothing." Miller sued Columbia Pictures and won the case, and Death of a Salesman was picketed by groups such as the WEC, rendering Career of a Salesman to a patronizing failed attempt to separate the studios from anti-American sympathies. Primarily, Death of a Salesman acts as a criticism of American capitalism, suggesting that the American dream, the idea that anyone can become wealthy if they work hard enough, is a fallacy. This is represented through Willy Loman's idealization of his brother, Ben, who traveled to Africa and made his fortune in mining. Willy holds his brother up to his sons as a symbol of proof of the American dream, and wants him to turn out just like him. However, Ben does not make an actual appearance in the film, as he died years before. Rather, he is shown through Willy's daydreams and flashbacks, presenting only how Willy remembered Ben. Through this, Ben takes on a ghostly facade throughout the film, symbolizing the intangibility and fallacy of the American dream. Further reinforcing this fallacy is Willy's blind belief that the American dream works. Willy's idea of success is based solely around the accumulation of wealth through his job as a salesman, arguably representing the lifeblood of capitalism, as it is based around individual profit and wealth in a competitive environment. However, this fallacy gradually presents itself to Willy, as Biff is unable to get a job in sales, and Willy is carelessly let go of his job after spending the entirety of his working career in the one job. From this, Willy's idealistic view of capitalism crumbles around him, and he decides that he is more use dead than alive to the family, taking his own life in order to give his life insurance money to his family. Through Willy's death, the anti-capitalist narrative solidifies itself, as it represents the shattering of the American dream fallacy. Death of a Salesman becomes an important film given the time of its production, as it carries clear anti-American sentiment in a time that was entirely concerned with the preservation of American values against the communist threat. The political climate of 1950s America was one of paranoia and hysteria. This came to be represented not only in the films themselves, such as the emergence of the alien invasion cycle, but also through the efforts of government and activist groups to uphold traditional American values. The imprisonment of the Hollywood 10 and the HUAC trials showcase the severity of paranoia within the country, while the case of Career of a Salesman exemplifies just how careful producers had to be with the sentiments that were being portrayed on screen given the political climate.
I am holding in my hand a microfilm of very highly confidential, secret State Department documents. These documents were fed out of the State Department over 10 years ago by communists who were employees of that department and who were interested in seeing if these documents were sent to the Soviet Union, where the interests of the Soviet Union happened to be in conflict with those of the United States.